Hello everybody, and welcome to the UST Max Center for this quarter's Luminary Lecture. It's my pleasure to have you all here with us in person, right here in the classroom, as well as via Zoom. It's just wonderful to see so many people joining us for tonight's special event. My name is Carla Alcindor, and I am the Senior Director of the UST Max Center, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker to you this evening, Dr. George Harne. As Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Harne brings a vision of Catholic education to his work that is animated by the thought of Plato, Cardinal Newman, Joseph Piper, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. In his role as Dean, Dr. Harne cultivates the treasures of the school, its faculty, students, and programs, ensuring that it flourishes in light of the greater mission of the university and draws even more deeply on the sources of that mission, particularly the great Catholic intellectual and spiritual traditions that we all know and love. He also champions the school within Houston, regionally, and in the nation at large. After receiving his PhD in musicology from Princeton University in 2008, Harne joined the faculty of Magdalen College of the Liberal Arts in Warner, New Hampshire. There, he later served as the academic dean from 2009 to 2011 and as president from 2011 to 2020, when he left there to join UST as our executive dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. George Harne.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Dr. Alcindor, and thank you, Brenda, and thank you everyone who's here tonight for this talk. I'm glad you could join us, and it's nice to be meeting in person and see faces, and I'm grateful for the technology of Zoom as well, so we have our guests online. We're going to be talking tonight, I think the official title is Luminary Lecture, The Love of Learning, Education for Human Flourishing. I confess that upon rereading the title of this talk, I was struck, somewhat amused, and slightly embarrassed by the alliteration. If you count the L's, the L in flourishing, we have 5 L's in just 10 words, 4 of those at the beginning of those words. Now, as an academic, I have to confess that it reminded me of a notorious poem composed in 1530 by one John Leo Placentius called the Pugna Porcorum, or the War of the Pigs, in which every word of all 248 lines of this Latin hexameter poem begins with the letter P. So I thought, well, where's that going to lead? And then I realized it's going to lead nowhere, right? It's a dead end. How could I introduce the Pugna Porcorum at the beginning of a lecture for very practical-minded people about liberal learning? It would only further cast the idea of liberal education into disrepute, right? And you're like, what is this guy doing? And so as I thought about it, though, I realized, the author of this poem placed voluntary constraints on his own work. I'm going to begin this poem, every word's going to begin with P, and it led to a level of and kind of creativity that would have not happened if he could have just chosen any words. And it struck me that that's not unlike the situation we face with regard to liberal learning in our own lives. We have busy schedules. If you were to map out your days and your weeks, how much time do you really have to give to cultivating the life of the mind, to cultivating the higher things? Most of us have schedules that are pretty packed. Those are constraints. And yet, like the author of the Pugna Porcorum, our lives and those constraints can become the occasion for creativity and for growth. Not unlike our own physical natures. We're mortals in mortal bodies in time, moving through time. Those are very serious limitations. And yet God thought it was appropriate to give us those limitations to prepare us for eternity. So the limits of our own lives don't have to be impediments. And so as we're going along, and as I'm offering some thoughts, there might be a conversation going on in the back of your head, a voice that says, that's impractical, that can't be done, it can't be done. And I would encourage you to challenge those thoughts, keep an open mind, and just think about what might be possible even within the constraints of our lives. Perhaps not unlike the Pugna Porcorum, certain limitations can become the occasion for creativity and flourishing. So let's begin. I'll offer 3 courses to this meal. I think the food out there was pretty good. I hope the food in here will be equally as good. First with Dante. So we'll begin with Dante. And we'll begin with the nature of the human person, our ultimate end, and how our capacities to see and know are bound up with our capacities to love. And that's the anthropological course, if you will. So let's begin with the human person. The second course is Joseph Pieper, and we'll consider the difference between work, spare time, and leisure, and how these, building on the anthropology we learned from Dante, relate to our destiny, our knowing, and our loving ultimately of God. And then third, I can't leave out Cardinal Newman. And we'll consider Saint Benedict as a kind of model for our own lives, reflecting on how we can reclaim the external conditions and the internal conditions to cultivate a love for learning and leisure, which in turn leads us closer on our journey to our Creator. So we'll begin with Dante, we'll move to Pieper, and then some Newman. So those are the three courses. First, Dante. Most of us read the Inferno in high school, and we remember all these gruesome punishments, but we're not going to go there. We're going to look at Paradiso, and there are two passages, both of which I think reveal a lot about our nature, about what it means to be human. The first has to do with how we see and how that's related to love, and how that leads to ultimately fulfilling that for which we were created. In Canto 26, Dante is in a dialogue with St. John. And if you've read Paradiso recently, you'll remember that he has basically 3 exams. And in fact, he compares it to what it's like to be an undergraduate. And the first exam is with St. Peter, who quizzes him on faith. Right? So you're somewhere between earth and the highest heaven, and you're being interrogated by St. Peter about the nature of faith. Could be a bit unsettling, a bit disorienting. I'll give spoiler alert, he makes it through that test, okay? The second test is with St. James, and that's on the nature of hope. Notice trend, faith, hope, and charity, right? Or love, right? So he makes it through St. James. So he is struck blind along the way. And he ends up ultimately with St. John. And the topic of the exam there is love. Notice the play of the good and knowing and loving. The good, seeing the good, knowing it is good, and loving. Here's what he wrote. For good, as it is good, and known as good, enkindles love, and lights love all the more, according to the good it comprehends. So toward that being, with a capital B, so superior that every other good a man may find is only a reflection of his splendor. More than toward any others, the keen mind must move in love. Let me unpack this. If we comprehend the good as good, it will enkindle love within us. And all secondary goods tend toward the ultimate good, which is God, who is the source of all that good. So we have to see it, and then in our minds, it registers as good. And this all happens in less than a second. We see it as good, we recognize it as good, and it enkindles desire within us, which is a kind of love, and enkindles love for that good, and we begin to move toward it. And if we climb the ladder of being all the way up, those secondary goods will take us to the source of all good, the source of all being. And this all happens super fast, right? But notice you have to have time to actually see. What happens if you're blind and you can't see? What happens to your capacity to love and to desire the good and to move on that journey if you can't see? Why might you not be able to see with the eyes of your soul? Maybe you're blind for some reason, right? You don't have that capacity. But maybe you're distracted. Maybe you stopped seeing and you didn't realize it. So that's one of the things Dante teaches us. So as a corollary, if we are blind and distracted to death, as so many of us postmoderns are, we will never have the occasion to see, and by extension to see the good. To paraphrase a famous Hebrew teacher, we have eyes, but we see not. We have ears, but we hear not. Does that adequately describe where many of us have been in our lives at various points, and many of our colleagues moving in this path through the world? And where does this seeing, knowing, and loving lead if we can learn to see again? Dante would say it leads to God. But this seeing that leads to loving, that leads to fulfillment in God, is at the heart of liberal learning. So we might associate liberal learning with history or philosophy or theology or geography or things that aren't professional. But properly understood liberal learning has as its core the seeds of this seeing. All right, so to follow Dante's reasoning from within our own context, we need time to see the good as good. And we need time to see and participate in the wonderful secondary goods in our lives as steps upward. So what might these be? These can be the good of nature, right? The goods of nature that we experience. The good of music, the good of art, the good of friendship, the good of the love we know within a family, or any other thousands of goods that we might encounter. And these, when properly loved, lead us higher. But this isn't accidental. It's not something that we have to learn culturally. It's actually deep within our created being. In Canto 1, to go back a little bit in Paradiso, Beatrice confirms that all of us are ordered through our created nature to rise. Dante, if you remember the end of Purgatorio, found himself moving up. And he's shocked. Last time he checked, he was in a garden, being berated by Beatrice for all of his failings, okay, with a griffin and a bunch of other things, weird things going on. Now he finds himself ascending, and he's like, how is this happening? How can this possibly be? Here's what Beatrice tells Dante. All natures in this order, this is the created order, lean and tend, each in its distinctive manner, toward its source. Some to approach more near, and others less. Everything is ordered in a direction. Whence from their various ports all creatures move on the great sea of being, with each one ferried by instinct given from above. God places within each being an instinct to move towards something. This water bottle has an instinct. If I drop it, it's going to instinctually go down. Fire has an instinct. It ascends, right? So even brute material objects have a kind of instinct. She says, this is what makes the fire rise toward the moon. This, the prime mover of the mortal heart. This makes the heavy earth condense into one. Nor does this bow with target-clearing art strike only things that lack intelligence, but things with intellect and love. So things that have an intellect and love also have this. They have a created ordering within them to take them to a particular place. And to that place, she says, as to our destined sight, we're speeded by the power of that cord, shooting each arrow in its happy flight. So Beatrice and Dante are speeding upward from the Garden of Eden at the top of Mount Purgatory, because that's how they were ordered, how they were created to move. And Dante would say that's how we were all created. We were all created for this ascent. No more amazement should it bring to you that you ascend than if a mountain stream should tumble rushing to the plains below. As a mountain stream falls, so we ascend. But it would be a cause of just surprise, she says, if, free of every bar, you should remain like a flame on earth and not rise. So it should surprise us if we don't have this desire for higher things. Thus we are ordered by our very nature to rise. It is natural that when our minds and bodies are not taken up with some other task, that we turn our attention to higher things. Aristotle captures this succinctly and partially when he wrote, all men by nature desire to know. Think of little children. Why? Why, mommy? Why, daddy? Now, at a certain point, the children we learned to stop asking that question. Because it drives your parents crazy, right? I have 5 children and it drove me crazy. But that desire to know is natural. No one had to teach them to ask why. We had to teach them to restrain themselves, okay? But the idea is that all of us still deep inside have that desire to know why. Even if it's been suppressed, tamped down, it's still there. And what follows, if Dante is right, what I propose is not contrary to our natures. It is not an imposition. In fact, it's a resurrection. A resurrecting of the ordering of our lives as we were created to experience them, ordered as creatures to our Creator. All of this is ordered to a concept that we're going to introduce here that you've heard before, no doubt, and that's the idea of leisure, right? It's a term, I think the first time I heard the word leisure as a young person, it was in the term leisure suit, right? I am a child of the 70s. I was born in the late 60s, but what do they say about the 70s? The 70s had all all of the bad things about the 60s, but none of the good things, right? And that's when my parents decided to have me, and I got to grow up in the 70s, right? So leisure suit, I still don't know that I know. I think I Googled it once to see what a leisure suit was. I am not talking about that, okay? Just to be clear, I'm talking about leisure as something else. So we move from Dante to Pieper, right? And I think some of you may have received a little essay called Work, Spare Time, and Leisure. And if you read it, that's great. Then you'll have some idea of what I'm talking about. And I hope it's clear even if you didn't. In this essay, he talks about three terms that are pretty straightforward on their surface. Work is what we do to provide for our needs, particularly our material needs. And it's ordered to something else. It's not really for its own sake. We work for something else. And work is a good thing, don't get me wrong. According to Genesis, work was part of the lives of Adam and Eve before the fall. Remember, the fall entailed the frustration that goes with our work. We plant and it doesn't yield the harvest, right? Work itself is a good thing, all right? So work is not a bad thing, don't get me wrong with that. The frustrations we experience in our work come from the fall, not from work itself. Yet Pieper points out some hidden suggestions. One is from the Greeks, the idea that we work for the sake of leisure. What is that about? Right? Okay, but let's hold off. We'll go there in a moment. It is clear that we work to earn our bread, but working for leisure, what might that mean? Let's look at the second term, spare time. The term has a direct reference back to work. Spare time has almost no intrinsic positive meaning. Spare time is only understood in relation to work, and the two go together as a kind of pair. Spare time isn't so much rest from work as it is rest for work. Okay, and that's how most of us and most of our fellow Americans approach the weekend, right? We recharge so we can go back to work, all right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's not a bad thing at all. Some of this is captured in English with the word workday, okay? Or even in its German form. But there's another word that goes with workday that's kind of its complement, and that's holiday. Workday and holiday. But let's parse holiday. Holla, what's that come from? What's the word? Holy. Holy day. Which opens a whole can of worms. What the heck is a holy day? Right? Does anybody remember? And what do the holidays have to do with holy days? Ooh, do we really want to go there? I think we should. So, a holiday was once a holy day, a feast day, a different kind of day. And this brings us to our third term, leisure. If work is a good thing that we do for the sake of other things, like food, clothing, and shelter, or even the higher things, and spare time is a break from work so that we can go back to work, what is leisure? Well, maybe we step back and we consider two other things first. Two types of time, chronos and kairos. Anybody else got a chronometer? I think most people have them on their phones now, right? I have a chronometer here telling me that I need to move more quickly through my text, otherwise we're going to be here longer. So chronos belongs to the world of work and spare time. Kairos belongs to leisure. So if you don't remember anything else about leisure, just think of the two different kinds of time. Chronos goes with work and spare time. Kairos, both Greek words, goes with leisure. Chronos is the time of our watches. It's the time of the clocks we punch at the beginning of our workday and at the end. It's the time that we measure our weekends. Chronos is the time that we use to measure our spare time. But also remember this. Chronos was a Greek, anybody know? God. What did Chronos do to his children? Anybody know? Ate them. Not exactly the kind of father you want for Father's Day, right? He ate his children. Chronos ate his young. Time consumes. Where did the time go? We don't have enough time. There's never, ever enough time. Think of spare time and chronos as a kind of rest stop along the road. No one would ever go there for its own sake, right? It exists and it is ordered for the purpose of making a journey. Though a rest stop may be pleasant and have amenities, in New Hampshire, where I come from, the rest stops all have liquor stores because the liquor stores are run by the state and it's a source of revenue. So people in New Hampshire, I confess, they probably go to the rest stop for that purpose, right? But in most states, in normal states, you don't do that. The rest stop is something you do on the way. It's something you do and it's part of your travel. Work and spare time are ordered to a destination. And the Greeks and the classical Christian tradition would say that work and spare time are ordered to leisure. We work in order to have leisure. But Kairos is another kind of time. It's a time outside of time. It's a timelessness, a carefree timelessness. It is the time in which all sense of chronos stops. It is a foretaste of eternity. Some of you may be thinking like this lecture. It's a foretaste of eternity, but I hope not. It is a foretaste of eternity in which we experience heaven. This is the time of leisure. This is the time in which Dante is moving through heaven. It is the time of worship. It is the time of feasting. It is the time of reading to our children. It is the time of drinking with friends, eating with friends. It's the time in which we become more fully human on our way to becoming more than human. Leisure and Kairos. Work, spare time, chronos. Different kinds of time. Most of us have experienced this at some point. I hope multiple times in our lives. You forget about time because what you're doing for its own sake is so beautiful and so wonderful and so good. Something like this can be experienced in work occasionally, but then it becomes more than work, right? It's not the kind of work that Pieper's talking about. If Martha, working in the kitchen, was experiencing chronos, Mary, sitting at the feet of Jesus, was experiencing Kairos. So think about Chronos and Kairos, Martha and Mary. And it's not just about two types of time. It's about two types of activities unfolding within those times. Work is done for the sake of something else. It might be the most exalted of something, performing life-saving heart surgery on a child, for example. But it is different from the activity of Kairos. In the time of Kairos, we do things for their own sake. We worship God for who He is, not for what He'll do for us. We spend time with our friends, not for what they'll do for us. This isn't a networking business experience. This is my friend and I'm spending time with my friend. That kind of experience for their own sake. In Kairos, in leisure, like Mary, we can pray, we can write, we can garden, we can listen to music, we can read, we can talk, we can contemplate a painting, we can think, we can play, and engage in a whole host of activities. Note that some of those activities can also be done for work. But when they are done for work, it fundamentally changes the experience. You know this. Reading a book for pleasure, for leisure, is different from reading a book because you're going to have a quiz tomorrow. I don't want to exalt what we're doing right now too highly, but you're not getting a grade for this. Did they tell you this? There's no grade. This isn't going to go on your permanent record. I'm sorry if you had to come, someone made you come, but you're doing this for its own sake. And I hope at the end you'll say, yeah, I took something away. I got something out of this. But it's not for some external good. This can be a form of leisure, I hope. Jesus said Mary chose the better part, and Aristotle would agree. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he brings his readers in Book 10 to the place where he can speak about what is most fulfilling and what makes us most happy in a sustained, deep, compelling way. A kind of happiness, there's a special Greek word called eudaimonia, okay, which is human, another way to, sometimes it's translated as human flourishing. And it's at the border between the human and the divine. Aristotle says, this is where we become more than human. All right? This is the place, this activity is the time of contemplation, activity that is fully human, and in which a person is engaged with something for his or her own sake. When Jesus and Aristotle agree, I think it behooves us to pay attention. Okay? This is the essence of the third term that Pieper introduces to us, and that's leisure. But do we see how radically different this is from the way we normally think? As Americans, we're like Romans. The Greeks understood that contemplation was the highest human activity, but we're way too practical for that. We never would have cleared the land, built our cities. We never would have survived if we'd sat around contemplating at Plymouth Rock. Let's just be honest about that, okay? For all of its drawbacks in Manifest Destiny, there is a sense in which Americans are who we are and achieve what we achieve because we've actually inversed that. We've given spare time and work the priority. And in that way, we're kind of like Puritans, right? We kind of go back. We prove our holiness, our goodness, our godliness through the amount that we work and the amount that we save. And think about culturally how this works. So the word for seeing that Pieper's talking about and that Dante's thinking of is contemplation. Okay, we tend to associate contemplation with religious orders, people praying, contemplating, a kind of mysticism. There's another English word that goes with this that's also from the Greek, or actually it comes from the Latin, speculation. Does speculation have positive connotations in your mind? Most people know, oh, that's merely speculative, which is a nice way of saying he's wasting his time. Okay. Or land speculation, how about that? Okay. But those are the same words. Contemplare, speculare, or the Greek, theoretical. Oh, that's just theoretical. For those of us who are practical minded, who has time for that? But those are all at root the same activity of seeing deeply, of contemplating. Do you see how culturally we might have some of these things a little backwards? I hope so. I hope so. So that's Pieper's contribution. But let's think about this more concretely, because I promised you in the advertisements for this that this would be a practical piece, right? So if we're going to experience what Dante described and what Aristotle described, we will need to create time in our lives for leisure, activities for their own sake. I would say this is why God gave us Sundays. This is the place to begin. It's with Sunday. They're meant to be exactly for all of what we've been talking about. What did God do? He rested. He engaged in leisure. In some of the Greek and some of the Jewish writings, some of the commentary that came later in the Middle Ages, there's this wonderful story about God taking Leviathan and playing with him. God played with Leviathan. Play is Pieper has some negative things to say about play, but he's thinking about a different kind of thing. Play for its own sake. There's nothing to be gained from playing with Leviathan. But God is engaging in this activity. But notice what he did before he rested. He affirmed that creation was good. That's another part of this. If your outlook on life is that it's all bad all the time, you're not going to experience leisure. There has to be a fundamental capacity to affirm the goodness of creation. Right? So that's why God gave us Sundays. They're meant to be exactly what we're describing here. We don't just recharge. We completely unplug. And we show Chronos the door, inviting in Kairos. We worship first. That's the basis. Absolute basis is we worship. We rest. We affirm the goodness we see in the lives of those around us and in nature. We lose our sense of time, but not in a way that makes us comatose or pass out. Yeah, Sunday naps cover up, right, and check out. Rather, we lose ourselves with those whom we love in music, art, nature, things for their own sake. All of these activities can become part of leisure. Leisure is like the form, if you will. And these other activities, done for their own sake, without a sense of Chronos, inhabit that form. If we take Chronos out of the picture, these things can be part of leisure. If they're ordered for their own sake and then ultimately to higher things. And if they deepen our interior lives, we need to become more deeply human, more human on the inside, and strengthen our relationships. All of these things can become part of leisure. But what does this have to do with liberal learning, liberal education, the liberal arts? Notice liber, free. Liberal education is for free people to become more free. There's another play on the word liber. Anybody know what a liber is? A book. These are great ways to become free. Not the only way. Not everyone's a reader. But for those who are, this can be a way of becoming free and can become bound up with liberal education. So I think this all comes together. But what about us here and now? Right? This, again, I promise to be a bit practical. Those of us who are professionals or have had professional lives, how do we deal with this? For most of us, liberal learning was something we did as undergraduates. There was a core of the liberal arts that we had to check the boxes for. And those days might seem to be behind us. How do we recapture this? How do we recapture the liberal learning? I would say, first of all, reclaim your Sundays. And then, if possible, carve out some time in the morning. For most of us, it'll be early in the morning or later in the evening. I have 5 children. They're 20 and 9. So it's gotten a little bit easier, I confess. Now that my youngest is 9, I can get up and I don't have diapers to change and bottles to warm and things like that. So carve out some time in the morning to pray and to do these activities. And insert leisure in your day. But having become a Dante and moved on to Pieper, remember Dante teaches us that we're ordered to ascend. We're created for God and communion with God, a kind of contemplation that is ultimately the beatific vision. And Pieper distinguishes work, spare time, and leisure. So in order to do that seeing that Dante talks about, we have to have the leisure to do it in. Right? We have to have that space. But what about Newman? Well, I think Newman has some practical things to say to us as well. Are we in a city? I think we are. Trains, trucks, the workaday world is right there. It's like 20 feet away. It's good. No, this is great. I love this. Keeps everybody awake. Everybody awake? Okay. All right, good. So the thing everybody knows Newman is the idea of a university. I'm going to mention something here called his Benedictine essays. One of them is called The Mission of Saint Benedict, and the other is the Benedictine Schools. And these were recently published in a really fine edition. Newman does this funny thing. In his first essay, The Mission of Saint Benedict, he divides the history of the church into 3 categories, and he associates a different saint with them. The first is Saint Benedict, and that's sort of the youth of the church, the beginning of the church's period. And Benedict himself was a young person when he began that mission. And he associates poetry, but I don't think by poetry he means necessarily a rhymed sequence of words in a meter. I think he's thinking more about imagination. Poetry is part of it, but also music, the arts, things that we can engage in as a kind of leisure. Then the second phase, after Benedict, he associates with Saint Dominic, which is a kind of comprehensive vision. Think about the Summa Theologia. It's this comprehensive vision of reality in which everything is ordered, top to bottom, beginning to end. It's the kind of thing you do in graduate school when you write a thesis, right? It's this totalizing, comprehensive thing that takes all day, every day for years. Unless we go back to graduate school, most of us aren't going to have time for that. And the third thing is St. Ignatius. It's the Jesuit age. And that's the practical age. That's when you learn things about the real world that you can't learn from books or a monastery. It's the active life done in the service of the church. But think about what that looks like in our own age when it becomes debased and degraded. It becomes workaholism, right? Where we become slaves to our phones and our computers and our tools. The things that are meant to serve us, we serve them. It's not the good work before the fall in the garden. It's the frustrated, degrading work. It's like a man digging a hole 5 feet deep, filling it back up, moving 5 feet down, digging another hole 5 feet deep, filling it up. It's that kind of work, right? But Newman's not talking about that. He's talking about a kind of an elevated work of St. Ignatius. So I think these 3 things are extremely interesting. So you've got poetry, science, and prudence. Those are the 3 virtues that go along with each one. I think Benedict has something for us to learn about leisure, and that is this. If we can carve out Sundays, and if we can carve out some time each day, at the beginning of the day or at the end, even if it's just 30 minutes, we can engage in what Benedict did, which is ora et labora, prayer, and a kind of work that is really leisure, right? We can pray a little, we can read a little, we can think a little, we can have a glass of wine with a friend or our spouse, and we can have meaningful conversation that has no purpose outside itself, and we can lose ourselves in Kairos. Remember, those are kind of the tests. Is it Kairos or is it Chronos? Is it for its own sake or is it for the sake of something else? Does it cultivate who I am as a human being and strengthen my relationships? That's what leisure is, and that's what liberal education is meant to do. And as teachers, as parents, as friends, as family members, we are called to create these conditions in those settings for our students, our children, our grandchildren. It's not a waste of time. Remember to go back to Dante. We're made for this at the most fundamental level. Mary chose the better part. Work is good, but Mary chose the better part. So, I would encourage us, first of all, if you're interested, I would encourage you to read Pieper's book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. That essay that we included for this is a wonderful little summary of all of that. It's a great summary of leisure, but he goes into a lot of other really great details. This edition has an introduction by T.S. Eliot. It's a wonderful introduction. And I would encourage you to take a look at Pieper. It's interesting, something that Pieper says in this book. He quotes Thomas Aquinas, because we might be inclined to think, oh, this is selfish, right? This is kind of, this is my time, this is me time, right? You know, men of a certain generation were inclined to build man caves, right, where they could pull themselves away from their families, and it could become selfish, basically. I'm going to go do what I want to do with my friends, and you guys just, done. That's not what we're talking about. This is a pulling away so that we can return and be enriched. And it doesn't have to be alone, right? It's not a selfish thing. Here's what Aquinas says. This is interesting. It is necessary for the perfection of human society that there should be men who devote their lives to contemplation. It is necessary for society as a whole that there be men who engage in leisure and in contemplation. And Pieper adds, not for the good of the individual who devotes himself to this, but for the good of human society. Society needs these signs of contradiction. Society needs all of us in this room to be engaged in real leisure. It's a way of embodying a reminder that we were made for more. Work is good. It's a good thing. But Mary chose the better part. Somebody had to make the food. I mean, we honor Martha, Saint Martha. I mean, it's good stuff. I'm sure the meal was fantastic, right? But it's not the end. And I will say this, the church has struggled to figure out how to put this together. They've said, well, the life in this world, that's the active life, and the contemplative life is heaven. That was one solution. Another solution was, well, some people are going to do the contemplative life over here, and some are going to do the active life over here. And then there are others who try to integrate it. And I think Pieper and Dante and Newman would say, no, we need both in our lives. So this is what can make us more fully human. And this is what we can teach to our children and our grandchildren simply by reading them a book. It's a great way to do it. Read picture books. Read children's books to them. So let's go back to Dante where we started. Remember, Dante reminded us that we need to see the good first. We have to see it. We have to carve out time through leisure to make time to see the good. Seeing the good will elicit within us love. It's almost an automatic response. If you see something as good, it enkindles desire, right? When I walk by that table of food out there on the way out, it's going to enkindle desire. I'm not going to have to stop and think, do I desire? No, it's going to happen. Okay, I can predict, because every time I come to the Max, it's good food. I've been looking forward to this all night, right? So you see it, it enkindles desire and a love. And if you follow that, if they're well-ordered loves, they will lead you further and further on to God. So Dante, Canto 26, at the end of Paradiso, we see this interaction between reason, the gift of God, and love. If the Inferno and Purgatorio are about the correcting of Dante's will, his journey through Paradiso is largely about the correcting of his reason. He's learning. But when he gets to the end, he reaches a point where his reason can't keep going. God reaches out through a flash and brings him in, and he experiences love. Knowing is consummated in love. Listen to how this happens. Dante wrote, addressing God at first, O light that dwells within thyself alone, who alone know thyself, are known, and smile with love upon the knowing and the known. Then he describes it. As a geometer struggles all he can to measure out the circle by the square, squaring the circle, but all his cogitation cannot gain the principle he lacks, so did I stare at this strange sight. He's looking at the beatific vision, and he thinks he's looking up toward God, and he thinks he sees a human form. Why might that be? The incarnation. You get to the beatific vision, and lo and behold, there's a human form. So he's struggling. He's trying to figure out, what am I seeing? At this strange sight, to make the image fit, the aureole, and see it enter there. But mine were not the feathers for this flight. He realizes he can't ascend all the way. Save that the truth I longed for, God, came to me, smiting my mind like lightning, flashing bright. So Dante's reaching out, he's falling like St. Peter on the Sea of Galilee. He's failing, he can't reach it, he can't make it. But a light whacks him. Right? A divine inspiration comes. Here ceased the powers of my high fantasy, his intellect. Already were all my will and my desires turned, as a wheel in equal balance, by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. So he's reaching out. He's going as far as human contemplation can take. Remember how the loves ascend if they're properly ordered. He goes as far as he can. He realizes he can't go all the way, because none of us can, right? We need grace. Grace comes in, and his intellect, his will, and his desires. Those are the three parts of the soul, classically understood. The intellect, the will, and the desires. All three become in tune with God. And he's in communion in the beatific vision. This, Dante would say, is what we're called to do. This is what the liberal arts are meant to do. They're meant to be a kind of propedeutic, a kind of preparation for this. You see how hard it is at a university, right? When liberal education of the liberal arts, those are just, I got to take philosophy. Ugh. We're about 1,000,000 miles in the wrong direction from what it's supposed to be, right? So we have to do our best in the classroom to create these conditions. In our homes where we're so busy, you see how hard it is, right? Learning, homework, everything is just, it's ordered to this, the next thing. But liberal education, the love of learning, when it's ordered properly, leads to human flourishing in this life and the next. So that we can ultimately see the love that moves the sun and the stars. And that's what we try to do at UST. As challenging as it is, in the classroom, when the students are studying literature, when they're studying philosophy, theology, and the other liberal arts, we try to create the conditions, cultivate that interior life, give them a taste of that so that they can experience it. So, we're a long way from the Pugna Porcorum where we started, right? But as that poem has its own self-imposed limits, and you have your own limits in your lives, I hope you'll find some time just to cultivate that desire to know that we all were born with and see where it might lead. Probably upward is my guess. So, thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions, make comments, make snide comments. You can throw things, I don't know.
Yes, we do have time for questions, so please feel free to dialogue with Dr. Harne.
Could you tell me what the three things you said that Dante felt, or when he saw God? There were three.
Sure.
I missed it.
Sure. So there's kind of there's a kind of knowing. So he's stretching every ounce of his being to know, to comprehend, to understand. He's trying to figure out how can there be a human figure in the Trinity, right? And he's trying the way that you might try to square a circle, which is impossible. You can't find a common principle between a circle and a square that allows you to measure both within the same term. So he's knowing, intellecting, if you will, going as far as he can with his reason, his ratio, and it fails. God sends light, and then at that point it's about love and desire. And he describes it as a wheel turning. And we all know what it feels like when our will and our loves are out of harmony. And he's experiencing this not only united and in harmony, which he got in purgatory, but now they're united with God. So it's knowing, loving, and desiring are all harmonized and united with God. Not subsumed and erased, but harmonized. Yeah, there's a harmony. And that happens at the end of purgatory, I should say, where when he comes out of the final river in purgatory, he's basically been purified, and his reason and his will and his desires are harmonized within themselves. So there's none of this, well, I kind of want this, but I know I shouldn't, and my reason, and I'm interiorly out of sorts. None of that. But at the end of Paradiso, all of those are united with God.
But it took grace to get from knowing to love and desire.
He went as far as nature could go. And And I will make a distinction here that that Pieper makes between ratio and intellectus. So these are two activities of the mind. There are others, but two of them. Ratio is the kind of reasoning where we go from point to point. If you've ever done Euclidean geometry, you have the presuppositions and you move from step to step to step. It's a dialectical motion, a movement. And that's ratio. And that's fully human, right? Intellectus is a higher form of knowing, which is bound up with contemplation. It's a kind of openness. It's a receptivity. And I think that's what Dante experiences. He's been going as far as ratio can take him. And now there's this moment of intellectus, in which but it's a gift. Intellectus is something you receive. That's what Aristotle, pre-Christian philosopher, I think recognized as something more than human. There's something inside man that's more than human, and that's that intellectus capacity. And that's what Dante, it all happens very quickly, and it happens in verse, which is not always easy to hear someone read. But does that clarify?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody else?
Can you discuss learning in this dispensation in time with the web, with smartphones, with almost instantaneous Googling, as they say?
Sure. We're drowning in information. And we're also drowning in feelings. We're awash in feelings and facts, if you will, or apparent facts. So it's gotten to the point where it's hard to know what the facts are, right? So it's chaos. It's chaos. And I think this is all the more the reason to push back hard and try those issues of time. Most of us, if you've got a smartphone, if you have any kind of professional job, one of the first things you do in the morning is you look at your phone. Right? And if you wake up in the middle of the night, there's a good chance you look at your phone. Where is there room for leisure? Where is there time to actually step away from the work and think and to reflect? And this is just more complicated, I think, for our kids, right? They compare the sunset they see to the sunset they saw in a movie, right? And the things on the screen are more real. So I think we've been there for a while, but a kind of intentional living, a thoughtful kind of parsing of what is my relationship to technology? What is my relationship to time? How am I going to live? How do I want my children to live? Is it possible to have a kind of countercultural approach? It's really hard. It's really difficult. Don't want to be a Luddite. I don't want people to think I'm putting my head in the sand. But whose lives are these? Are these the lives of our family and our children, or do they belong to a corporation, right? Who wants to sell us something through their technology? So these. I think you have to get back to what does it mean to be human. We need rest. We need quiet. We have natures that were ordered to substantial relationships that we need, but you can't have those without time. You can't have those without a right kind of time. And we're called for a relationship with God, and we can't have that without time. So there's almost a kind of countercultural approach that I think is needed, in which we decide we're going to live our lives in a very intentional way and in a very different way. We're going to recover what it means to be human, and we're going to recover what the human purpose, the human destiny looks like, as best we understand it.
And how do we understand that? I keep thinking back here in the back of the room, listening to what you're talking about, and just dying to dive deeper into this whole meaning of life. I think early in your talk you alluded to.
Sure.
We're in preparation.
Yeah, I wish.
I'd love to hear your take.
I wish I had the answer. I don't, and I wish I could live out even the answers that I think I may have been given. We have a really great program for our faculty that was started by our VPA, Chris Evans, and it's called Formation for Mission. And all new hires, faculty and staff, go through this. And one of the very first things we do is we talk about what it means to be human. Because if you don't know what it means to be human, if you don't have some sort of anthropological starting point, how are you going to educate this person if you don't know who the person is? How are you going to lead them out of Plato's cave from not knowing to knowing if you don't even know the nature of the person you're trying to educate? So there are generally some things we come away with because we're a Catholic institution. But as we've seen in this talk, there are a lot of things that pre-Christians also intuited that are confirmed. One of them is that we have dignity as people. Apart from what we do, apart from what we achieve, we have an unerasable, ineradicable dignity. Now, we may behave in certain ways that cast a shadow over that, but we have dignity, we have worth, and no one can take that away. And that worth was a gift from outside. There was a creator that gave us that dignity, and we are creatures. So we have dignity as creatures who were created, and that is a relationship, which suggests a third thing, which we are by nature relational. We're social by nature. Some of us are introverts, but even those of us who are introverts, we are meant to be in relation, substantial relations with God and with other people. There is the complementarity of the sexes. Man and woman, he created them, and he called it good, right? That's another topic for another talk, right? If Aristotle's right, and I think our Christian and pre-Christian philosophical tradition affirms this, we were made to know. Think of the story of Adam naming the animals. There's a kind of knowing that goes on there that's pointing to that. So all of those things point to who we are and within a larger creation that is good. Benedict XVI talked about how Genesis came to be and how it was probably written down while the Israelites were in the Babylonian captivity. And it was probably done to counter the visions of creation that were so negative, that were common in the cults and religions of the Babylonian Empire, which is that creation is the result of these horrible fights between the gods and all the fallout that is what we see around us. That's a long way from, and it was good, right? So I think, so when I think about affirming the goodness of another person and their dignity, not that everything they do is right, and in fact loving someone might be pointing out that they're wrong, right? It's not a kind of be nice, right? It's a loving them for their good. I'm meant to be in relation. I'm meant to know and to love. And I have a destiny. It's not just the nature, but it's nature ordered to communion with God. So I think that's a starting point. And when you approach your students that way, not as, okay, I'm going to preach all this to them, but if that's the starting point, it changes how you teach. It changes how you design curriculum. It changes how you hire people to teach in your university. So I think those are getting the human. There's a story about getting the human person right. A CEO had a big speech, and Matthew Kelly, I think, uses this story. Had a big speech he had to give. His wife had other work to do that day. She left the house. He's there with his young son. His son keeps bothering him. He can't write his speech because his company really needs an inspiring speech because it's not going well at work. Finally, his son keeps interrupting, and so he grabs a magazine. He opens it up, and there's a map of the world. So he pulls it out. He rips it up. He gives it to his son. He says, "Go put this together." He thinks, okay, I got 20 minutes. Because my son's terrible at geography. I got 20 minutes. 5 minutes later, his son comes back. He's like, how did you do that? How did you get the map of the world right? And his son said, well, I noticed that on the other side there was a man's face. And I figured if I get the man right, I'll get the world right. So we've got to know who we are. We've got to know what it means to be human. And if we get that wrong, everything else is going to be wrong. Our institutions will be wrong. Our society will be wrong if we misunderstand what it means to be human. So anyway, I hope that was helpful.